Diese eine Karte hat Clash Royale komplett gerettet. Doch welches ist und was die Karte so besonders macht, erfährst du jetzt. Trag gerne Creator Code BigSpring kostenfrei im Shop ein. Kuss geht raus und wir gehen rein. Reds ist natürlich wie immer in der Beschreibung verlinkt. Checkt ihn also ab und er hat jetzt ein Video gemacht, warum Mega Minion seiner Meinung nach Clash Royale gerettet hat. Wir gehen rein.
Clash
Wird
Royale
sehr, sehr
for a long
interessant.
time has been a fairly simple game to understand.
Ja, das
And back in
stimmt.
2016, there were far fewer cards than there are today.
Man muss halt echt mal überlegen, wie komplex Clash Royale über die Zeit geworden ist. Mit Evos und so weiter. Damals super simpel zu verstehen. Heutzutage ist das schon ein bisschen anders.
At the game's launch, there were only 3 cards that could fly and attack other
Ja,
troops.
stimmt.
Minions, Minion Horde,
Minion Horde und
and
Baby
Baby
Dragon.
Dragon.
Ja.
The Minions were fairly good single-target damage dealers for their elixir cost, but
Ja.
very susceptible to spells and splash cards. The Baby
Stimmt.
Dragon, on the other hand, dealt splash attacks and was fairly resistant to spells given its higher health,
Macht
but
kein
dealt
Damage.
very little damage per second.
Ja,
There were
richtig.
2
Und da hat eine Karte gefehlt, die tatsächlich genau beides macht. Spells Resistant und gute Damage. Mega
other flying
Minion.
cards, Lava Hound and Balloon, which couldn't
Ja.
attack troops and
Geil.
neither
Ich
were
bin sehr, sehr gespannt, was er jetzt zu erzählen
incredibly
hat.
popular. Lava Hound with Balloon was a combo that was occasionally seen together, but didn't thrive in the meta, partially as a
Ja.
result of not
Grüße gehen raus an Dominik. Ich wünsche mir, dass es heutzutage auch keiner macht, aber irgendwie haben wir Dooms, ja?
enough air support options. There was certainly a high demand for more air units, which eventually led to the creation of the Mega Minion,
Ja.
a card that kept the benefits of having a high DPS for its cost, like minions, and the
Ja.
benefits of being resistant to bigger spells, like
Ich bin ehrlich, das Mega Minion ist eine der geilsten Karten, die es je für mich Top 3 der geilsten Karten in Clash Royale. Und deswegen fühle ich das Video auch so, weil die Karte einfach so gesund für Clash Royale ist, es ist
the Baby
geisterkrank.
Dragon, all for just 3 elixir. But
Ja.
like many older cards, it successfully filled a role for its time, but slowly phased out of the meta due to an ever-changing game environment with increased competition.
Ja,
so today
stimmt. Damals war das Mega Minion, als es rauskam, aber sehr, sehr broken. Es war
we're going
absolut
to cover
broken.
the entire history of the Mega Minion,
Ja,
when,
jetzt
why,
bin ich
and where
gespannt.
it worked well, and observe how it fell to where it is today.
Ja.
The Mega Minion was officially released into Clash Royale on September
Müsste, wollte ich gerade sagen, Ende 2016 gewesen sein, aber noch vor Graveyard. Das Mega Minion kam mit den Grand Challenges raus und ich weiß ganz genau, ich habe meine erste Grand Challenge gewonnen mit einem Giant Mega Minion Deck, Freunde. So geil.
2016. So where would this troop fit in? What would incentivize a player to include this card over the regular minions and Baby Dragon? Like I already explained, this card was resistant to spells, being able to survive
Ja.
a poison, whereas the regular minions couldn't even survive arrows. So even though both minions and Mega Minion were able to fully counter
Oh,
a
so
balloon,
geil, wenn ich
for
das sehe, ne?
example, you didn't have
So
to worry
geil.
about your Mega Minion being taken out by a spell or even a supportive Baby Dragon. The Mega Minion was also a better counter to splash cards like the Wizard and Witch that the minions were ineffective against. The Mega Minion dealt enough damage as to where
Das
it could
Mega Minion war
one-shot
so eine Karte, da fragt man sich, warum hat Clash Royale diese Karte nicht schon früher ins Spiel gebracht? So doll hat die Karte eine Lücke
anything up
gefüllt.
to and including archers, even though
Ja.
the combined damage per second of 3 minions was slightly higher than Mega Minions, Mega Minion was
Minion
much
trotzdem
more
viel besser.
reliable. But on the downside, since it was only one unit and had a slower attack speed than a regular minion, it was terrible against swarm
Ja.
cards like Skeleton Army. This unit also had a movement speed of
Digga,
medium.
damals hat man einfach Mega Minion an der Brücke gespielt und es hat 2 Hits gemacht. Das muss man sich mal reinziehen. Das ist heutzutage unvorstellbar und völlig
Unlike
verrückt.
the other flying units, which had a movement speed of fast. But despite that, Mega Minion did more damage to
Guck mal
towers
jetzt hier.
if left
Guck mal.
alone, getting 2
Guck mal.
full swings if
Guckt
not
euch das
attended
an, wie
to.
krank,
Both
Digga.
Minions and Mega Minion
Du
were not
konntest kein Mega Minion, damals war es ein Metaplay, Mega Minion an die Brücke zu spielen. Heutzutage kannst du es vergessen. Das macht einen Hit, okay, völlig egal. Deswegen wird es auch nie so gespielt. Aber Mega Minion ist so eine unterschätzte Karte. Es ist so ein geiles Konzept.
very threatening on offense, but Mega Minions seemed even worse than minions in most offensive situations.
Ja,
like if you were
geht.
trying to use it to absorb an Inferno Tower for a
Ich
big
bin ehrlich,
tank.
Mega Minion war da das komplett stark. Also ich kann nicht relaten das zu dem, was er
When
sagt.
analyzing the advantages and disadvantages between Mega Minion and minions, at a glance, it can seem like there are fair reasons to use one over the other both ways. But almost immediately after release, it was clear that Mega Minion Minion was naturally the stronger choice
Ja.
almost every single time, besides a few niche
Ja,
situations.
ganz genau.
Because in only 1 week, this card was already being seen in 1/5 of top ladder decks
Das ist krass, nach einer Woche. Und damals war es ultra schwer, eine Karte zu maxen.
and had a prominent role in the most.
Ja, genau so ein Deck. Genau von so einer habe ich gesprochen. Ich glaube sogar, das könnte, vielleicht noch mit Guards drin, mein allererstes Deck gewesen sein, mit dem ich die 12 Siege geschafft habe. Genau so ein Deck, Chat. Ich habe es gesagt. Giant Poison Mega Minion. Das war's, Digga. Das war geil.
Which was Giant Poison, or
Ja.
Goizen for short.
Ja,
Even
Goizen.
though this
Gute alte
new strong
Zeiten.
air support unit should have theoretically brought Lava Hound into the meta, the data suggested it was doing worse after its release.
Das ist krass. Ihr müsst euch vorstellen, Bochum-Fan, okay? Damals noch Bochum-Fan 2016, 17, hat einfach Lava Loon erfunden und populär gemacht. Ohne Bochum-Fan würden die Leute vielleicht heutzutage immer noch nicht Lava Loon zocken. Damals hat man gedacht, was ist das für ein Spinner? Auf einmal ist er komplett damit abgegangen, hat auf seinen Nova-Accounts 2 Top-10-Finishes in einer Season gemacht. Es war
Mega
crazy.
Minion was clearly very strong, which is why it was a bit surprising when it didn't appear in the balance changes that happened 1 month after its release. You'd think they'd tone it down at least a
Ja,
little,
aber
but
haben
it
sie
appeared
nicht.
Supercell was being hesitant. Goizen was a very powerful combo that was getting
Und
the most
dagegen
attention
war es Mega Minion auch stabil.
by the community and Supercell themselves. So the October balance changes focused on toning down the power of that duo. It was the deck Mega Minion was working
Ja.
best in anyway, so it was sort of an indirect nerf. But of
Ja, ist true. Das Mega Minion ist natürlich schon generell eher im Beatdown-artigen Decks zu finden. Mit Miner würde man das tendenziell heutzutage eher nicht spielen. Damals hätte man es auch mit Miner spielen können, weil das Mega Minion zwar jetzt
course,
alleine einen
this
Ton
card
gemacht hat.
didn't need Goizen to thrive.
Ja.
It was still very versatile and powerful on its own.
Ja,
After the
definitiv.
October balance changes, Mega Minion rose to being the 3rd most popular card and 2nd most used troop card in
Das ist
top
krass.
ladder, appearing in a whopping 54% of the top ladder decks,
54% Nutzungsrate in Top-Ladder. Das müsst ihr euch mal reinziehen. Das ist
including the top
crazy.
3, which were all different
Ja,
archetypes.
Giant Lightning, oh mein Gott. Und Lightning hat man deswegen nur gespielt. Lightning hat man nur gespielt, weil es der einzige verlässliche Konter war gegen das meganische Minion. Ansonsten wäre dieses Deck niemals so stark gewesen, weil überall war das Mega Minion.
Types. There would be another set of balance changes on November 1st, but the Mega Minion would manage to avoid the nerf hammer yet again. Players were frustrated, stating the Mega Minion needed a nerf. And
Ja.
yet,
Ich würde tatsächlich sagen, ich glaube, das Mega Minion war der erste Nerf, war entweder Leben ein bisschen oder aber der Attack
it
Speed.
wasn't getting one.
Ich weiß
in
nicht
the
mehr ganz
top
genau.
50 winning battle decks in the King's Cup held at the end of October 2016, Mega Minion was in 43 or 86%
Also
of
das
them.
ist
And in
geisteskrank.
that
Das ist
same
eine
month,
absolut insane Quote, ne?
it officially rose to being the #1 card, not troop card, but card period.
Guck mal,
in
wie
top
schnell das
ladder,
auch Attack, Digga. Seht ihr den Unterschied? Das ist crazy.
being used by 84% of top ladder players.
Absolut
it was
heftig.
literally being used in everything from Giant to Hog Rider to Golem to Royal Giants.
Aber
to
ohne
Minor
Witz, ich sage euch
Control.
jetzt einen Call. Das Mega Minion, und das meine ich völlig ernst, ist die am wenigsten schlimme Karte, die broken ist. Sie passt in jedes Deck von jedem Archetype rein. Sie ist eine geile Karte. Du weißt, was dich erwartet. Sie rennt dich einfach nieder wie Goblin Giant, ohne dass du Skill brauchst, sondern du weißt, was die Karte kann. Und weil sie in jedes Deck reinpasst, kannst du sie auch im Prinzip immer überall reinpacken und sie damit in Anführungszeichen kontern. Und deswegen, wenn das Mega Minion broken wäre, ich glaube, ich würde mich nicht mehr beschweren. Ich würde es einfach zocken und es wäre die beste Karte, die, wenn sie broken ist, fürs Spiel, ist sie am gesündesten.
to Expo, and even
ihr
Lava
wisst,
Hound
was ich
was
meine.
finally starting to gain some traction with the Goizen duo faded out.
Ja.
This card was frequently now referred to as the Meta Minion.
Ja,
Some people
richtig,
even
Meta
commented
Minion,
on
ja.
it as being a flying Mini P.E.K.K.A. This
Ja.
card was so efficient at countering everything.
Ich
even
liebe
a
das Mega
giant.
Minion.
There weren't that many cards that could even attack air, so the Mega Minion being in the air
Ja.
kept it relatively
Ja,
safe.
stimmt. Damals gab es noch keine Scale Drakes. Inferno Dragon kam, glaube ich, auch etwas später. Aber auch der mit Sepp und so weiter hat da nicht so richtig den Stich
The only
gesehen.
real viable cost reasonable counters there seemed to be were the Musketeer and Archers. Even
Ja.
something like Spear Goblins were not reliable enough of a counter due to the popularity of
wegen
the
Sepp,
Zap
richtig.
that
Sepp
could
hat- jeder hat
instantly
Sepp
take
gespielt.
them out. You
Sepp
might
konnte noch Goblin Barrel One-Shot. Das war auch völlig
assume that
verrückt.
because Mega Minion was so good at what it did, that other flying cards like Minions would be boxed out. But they were actually still performing decently.
Krass.
In fact,
Jetzt haben wir noch gespielt. Das wusste ich, okay, in Kombination mit Lava. Und das stimmt. Damals hat man halt echt noch Lava Hund, Minions und Mega Minion gespielt. Heutzutage siehst du das halt niemals. Da siehst du einen Phoenix, da siehst du Scalydex und siehst eigentlich auch gar kein Mega-Minion mehr.
fact, that Lava Hound deck I just
Leider.
showed you, which was used on
Ey,
top
ohne
ladder
Witz, wenn die Mega-Minion so um 3 oder 4 oder 5% Damage buffen würden, ich würde es
by
lieben.
multiple players, had all 3 minion cards in it. I couldn't exactly find a reason as to why Supercell was refusing to nerf this card. It had been out for over 2 months by this point
Aber
and was
trotzdem
only
geil.
growing in popularity by the week and was now sitting at the very top. But the Mega
Einfach eine
Minion
geile
made
Karte.
one critical mistake in November, and that was surpassing the use rate of the log. Something I've
Das ist
noticed about
heftig.
overpowered cards throughout all
Guckt
eras
euch die
of Clash
Barbs
Royale
an.
history.
Ja, stimmt. Immer wenn das Log von der Nutzungsrate übertroffen wurde, musste Nerf kommen. Das
Is
war
that
so
no
der
matter
kritische
how
Punkt.
lenient they may be towards a broken card, once it surpasses the almighty
Ja.
log, it must be toned down.
Ja, so ist
I'm
es.
kidding here, but the log historically has been
War
kept
wirklich
in
so.
too strong of a state for most of its history, meaning its rates have typically been a good example of stats to represent an overpowered card. So
Ja.
now it was clear that it would not be able to avoid the nerf hammer much longer. Finally, on November 30th, 2016, the
30.
Meta Minion would be
November.
receiving a long overdue nerf. Its
Es muss der Attack Speed gewesen sein. Deswegen nur noch ein Hit macht, ne?
damage per hit would be reduced by 6%,
Oh, Damage 6%
as well
nur.
as receiving a 10th of a second hit speed.
Okay, und das ist der Knackpunkt. Das ist der Knackpunkt. Der Hitspeed hat das Mega Minion aus dem
There
Konzept
weren't any
gebracht.
major interaction differences from these changes. It would still be able to one-shot archers and get 2 hits on the princess
nee, never
tower
mind.
if left
Das war
alone.
noch gar nicht so. Okay,
But
krass.
overall, its damage per second was reduced by about 15%.
Das ist heftig. Ich
which
glaube, das Mega wurde dann sogar noch die ganze Zeit immer noch gespielt, weil es immer noch broken
is a
war.
lot, but justified for such a powerful card. Looking at the top ladder stats about 1 week after this nerf, it was still the most used card in top ladder, remaining
Das ist
in
verrückt.
83% of the decks.
Das ist verrückt. Die nerven das Mega Minion so krass. So ziemlich jede Karte, die du heutzutage nerven würdest mit solchen Stats, würde danach nicht tot sein, aber deutlich weniger gespielt werden. Und ihr seht, es hat einfach nichts gebracht, weil das Mega Minion vom Konzept her und vor allen Dingen der
The
Turm-Damage
nerf
so krass
hadn't made
waren.
a dent in its popularity. The Meta Minion was unstoppable. And just for
Crazy.
some further perspective, the second most popular card in top ladder at the same time was the
Malok, ne?
Archers at
Archers.
68%
Ja.
usage. A
Wegen des Mega Minion
whopping
Kontos.
15% behind. And they were primarily being used because
Wegen
they
Mega
were
Minion.
one of the, if not the best counter to the Meta Minion.
Richtig,
Later
ja.
in December, Archers were performing worse though because a new card, the Elite Barbarians, got buffed in the
Nah.
balance changes. And not only were they very strong
Ja.
in the meta,
Guckt
but
euch das
they
an.
could one-shot Archers, paving a path for the Meta
Ja.
Minion to thrive. It
Ja.
was a bit shocking that the Meta
Mega
Minion was
Minion E-Barbs,
absent from the
crazy.
December balance changes, given that the previous nerf didn't seem to accomplish what it was supposed to. There still wasn't great counterplay to this beast. Some argued its health should have been decreased. Why shouldn't a 3 Elixir card at least die to a 4 Elixir Fireball?
Ja, ist valid, aber das war ja beim Eismagier auch lang so. Der Eismagier war lange unfassbar stark unter dem Radar, weil er nicht vom Feuerball starb und da haben sich auch alle drüber aufgeregt.
Even if
Was
the
auch
Mega
berechtigt
Minion
ist.
did die to Fireball, the Mega Minion player would be up 1 Elixir. A
Ja.
major interaction change like this seemed necessary, but
Yeah, that's
Supercell
true.
was stubborn on keeping its health the same, as in the next set of balance changes in January 2017, they nerfed the Mega Minion's damage again by 4% and
Okay.
slowed down its hit speed by another 10th of a
Und das ist halt der Unterschied. Ich glaube, das war der
second.
Unterschiedsnerf.
They emphasized in the explanation that they wanted to keep it feeling armored and resistant. These changes now meant it required 5 shots to take out a Baby Dragon or a Mini P.E.K.K.A. instead of 4.
Aber ich bin ehrlich, dass es 4 Hits gebraucht hat, um Baby Dragon auszuschalten, ist auch crazy.
And its damage per second overall was nerfed by about 10.5%.
Das sind
I
so
think this was
heftige Nerfs,
actually
ne?
a good approach because the Mega Minion's main purpose was to be a more resistant flying defender.
Ja.
Nerfing the health would have only made it more similar to minions. The
Ja.
Mega Minion was special
true.
because it couldn't just instantly be wiped away with a spell for an equal or -1
Haben Sie recht,
elixir
haben Sie
trade
gut gemacht.
and then not have to be thought about. But for such a cheap cost, having that advantage plus the advantage of not being a ground unit required a lower DPS to be balanced. Supercell had clearly underestimated all the factors originally. I do
Allein,
agree
dass
the Mega
diese
Minion
Nerfs nicht gereicht haben, um das Mega Minion so ein bisschen zu töten, ist schon
should
verrückt.
have been kept at 3 Elixir to better compete with minions, But it made me wonder how a version of Mega Minion that kept all of these benefits at 4 Elixir would have influenced the game. This
Ja,
latest
und dann haben wir den Phönix bekommen.
balance change may not have seemed like a big deal, since it was similar to the
Und der war Brock für ein halbes Jahr.
set of changes, and those changes barely hurt it. But that wouldn't be the case here. The use rate took a
Ja.
pretty big hit after the balance change
Das ist ordentlich.
and continued to dwindle in the following weeks. Minions had surpassed the Mega Minion by this point,
Krass, damals haben wieder mehr Leute Minions als Mega Minion
becoming the
gespielt.
most
Heftig.
used troop card in Top Ladder. This was in part thanks to the major Zap nerf in January. Zap was much less popular now, and even though Zap couldn't take out minions unless it was 2 levels higher, it left them incredibly fragile. The Zap nerf,
Ja.
along with the new Goblin Gang, saw in a new era of Swarm and Bait decks.
Du,
And
Zirkus,
as we
ein Raid, vielen
already
Dank.
discussed, the Mega Minion was
Ja,
ineffective
ist schlecht
against
gegen
Swarm
Swarm, true.
cards. So on top of the nerfs,
Ja.
there simply wasn't as much of a demand for Mega Minion right now. Plus, new cards like the Dark Goblin and Executioner that could attack air were added. So although the direct nerfs seem fairly small, there were certainly a lot of indirect nerfs that contributed to the Mega Minion's downfall. But I wouldn't
Ja.
even call this a downfall, because a downfall implies the card was useless. And
Richtig.
that wasn't true by any stretch. In fact,
Mega
by
Minion
the
ist immer
end
noch
of
stabil.
February, the use rate rose a bit again to a whopping 38% in Top Ladder.
Das ist halt so mächtig. Man muss das mal reinziehen. 38%. Heutzutage, die Karte würde instant tot genervt
Making Mega
werden.
Minion the second most used troop card in the game, only behind, surprisingly, the Minions. Even though these cards were sort of in competition with each other, they weren't really stepping on each other's toes. In
Das ist
fact,
echt heftig. Heutzutage würdest du gefühlt nie mehr Mega Minion und Minions in einem Deck spielen. Damals, da war das einfach so.
the most used deck in Top Ladder at this time contained all 3 Minion cards.
Oh, Giant Doppel-Minions. So ein schönes Deck, Freunde. Später mit Nachtexte.
I know
Geil.
I discussed how the environment was changing for the worse when it came to Mega Minion, but that was a bit misleading because the climate was changing in ways that favored it as well. As we kind of discussed earlier, the Log was the single most popular card in the game at the moment, and being able to completely avoid any potential threat from it was a huge benefit to flying cards. The Log's popularity naturally contributed to the Zap's fall, which benefited Mega Minion because Zap could prevent all chip damage from a standalone Mega Minion, whereas the Log didn't prevent anything. And with arrows not being
Ja.
too prominent at the moment, it gave some more room for other minion cards to breathe. Having air defense was so crucial in this environment. 8 of the top
Absolut.
10 decks and 5 of the top 5 had one of these cards in it.
Das ist wirklich krass. Das ist heutzutage absolut gar nicht mehr so. In den Top 5 Decks wurden 5-mal diese 3 Karten gespielt für eine Minion-Horde. Die ist ja so leicht zu kontern heutzutage. Niemand würde mehr Minion-Horde spielen, außer irgendwelche geistkranken Cheeser, die ihr Deck, seitdem die Mauer gefallen ist, nicht mehr geändert haben.
Mega Minion was still an extremely versatile card thriving in a variety of archetypes. It could be argued that it still needed some more toning down, but it wouldn't have been a great time for it, since these flying cards were helping to keep overpowered ground cards like Log in check. Without their
true.
presence, powerful ground-based cards would be even more of a pain. Keep in mind, the Minion's popularity was way higher than it was a few months prior without receiving any balance changes, so
Ja.
there was clearly a huge factor of environment here. The
jeden
arrows had
Fall.
a speed buff in March, which helped Mega Minion surpass them in terms of popularity.
Stimmt, damals waren die Arrows noch so ewig andauernd.
Throughout
Stimmt,
the rest of
andauernd.
2017, Mega Minion stood its ground, remaining in the top 10 most popular cards no matter the environment. The only time the Mega Minion barely slipped out of the top 10 was during the Night Witch's reign. The Night Witch in
Nachtexte,
its
Digga,
early
ja,
days was a
stimmt.
bad
Gegen Nachtexte ist Mega Man auch nicht so gut, oder zumindest gegen die Nachtexte damals.
quickly filling the arena with these little pests after being placed. This was pretty overwhelming for a slow attacking single target unit,
Ja.
as you could imagine. Even at its worst though, it was still objectively one of the best cards in Clash Royale. And the only
Ja,
balance
Golem
change it
Mega Minion.
received throughout the entire year was in January. Mega Minion seemed like it was just getting away with being too strong. How could this card's reign possibly be quelled? In the early months of 2018, it was only doing better. Other cards that rose to prominence in 2017,
Das
like
ist wirklich
Inferno
krass,
Dragon
dass es Mega Minion so lange zwar jetzt am Ton gemacht
and
hat.
Flying Machine, didn't
Hätte
seem
ich
to be
nicht mehr so in
competing
Erinnerung
with the
gehabt.
Mega Minion whatsoever. Those cards, if anything, only increased the demand
Ja,
for Mega
ja,
Minion
ja. Mega Minion unfassbar stark gegen
help
Flugi,
deal
gut
with
gegen
them.
Inferno.
But these card additions, along with some other changes, could suggest that Supercell was trying to indirectly diminish the Mega Minion's versatility rather than directly.
Ja, ich glaube aber nicht, dass sie das Mega Minion nerven wollten durch Flugmaschine und so weiter. Ne? Das waren gute Karten an sich, aber ich glaube nicht, dass das den Hintergrund hat, dass sie das Mega Minion deswegen nicht genervt haben.
Think about it. You saw new cards released that were effective cheap counters to the Mega Minion, as well as the release and rise of more troop targeting flying units. And even some balance changes, such as nerfing the Crown Tower damage of all spells, making them overall less prominent in the meta, giving more room to competitors that were susceptible to spells being implemented. Now, do I believe that Supercell was releasing new cards and implementing balance changes specifically to indirectly nerf the Mega Minion?
Das war nicht so.
No. But I think because this card filled such a unique role, that it wasn't seen as having too good stats for a 3 elixir card, but rather lacked proper competition for the spot it filled. Being a spell-resistant 3 elixir flying unit was a niche no other card could fill. I think the Mega Minion was comparable to the Miner. The Miner was a 3 elixir troop that could be placed anywhere on the arena.
Ist true. Miner auch. 3 Elixier, nicht stark für seine Stats, aber weil es, und das ist ja bei Miner fast schon bis heute so gut, es gibt Drill und so, aber es gibt kaum Konkurrenz für den Miner in seinem speziellen Spot. Er ist die einzige Karte, die das macht, was ein Miner machen kann. Und deswegen ist er auch so beliebt und so stark in der Usage Rate, was aber nicht heißt, dass er OP ist. Er hat einfach keine Alternativkarten. Miner in meinen Augen übrigens auch eine sehr gesunde Karte fürs Spiel, für die Balance, by the way. Auch sehr gesund.
Pressure from the community to nerf this card because it was widely seen as just being versatile and filling a very unique role, instead of having 2 good stats for 3 elixir. But even if the Mega Minion's lack of true competition was allowing it to thrive, arguably its stats were still too good for its low cost. In the February and April 2018 seasons,
aber wisst ihr, in der ganzen Zeit, die ihr jetzt schildert, haben sich die Leute eigentlich maximal am Anfang über das Mega Minion aufgeregt. Niemand hat das Spiel gequittet, oder zumindest niemand, den ich kenne, hat Clash Royale gequittet, weil das Mega Minion zu OP war. Mega Ritter, Crackerin, andere Karten, Hawkrider von mir das auch. Da kann ich das verstehen. Aber das Mega Minion, die mit Abstand gesündeste Karte fürs Spiel. Wenn die, ich sag's nochmal, wenn die heute broken wäre, ich würde nichts sagen. Ich würde nicht sagen, nerf Mega Minion.
Once again, was the most used troop finishing in top ladder being used in nearly or even more than half of the top 200
So eine geile Basic-Karte.
It wouldn't be until July 2018, a year and a half since its previous balance change, for it to appear in the balance changes yet again. Supercell was still refusing to touch its health. Once again, they opted to slow down its hit speed by 1/10 of a second.
Aber das war der Brecher, das war der Bruch fürs Mega Minion.
7% less damage per second. One major interaction difference this caused was now in a one-on-one interaction with no interference, Bats would win against the Mega Minion. This was the 3rd consecutive nerf. The Mega Minion now hit 0.3 of a second slower than it did upon release.
Das ist so heftig, wenn man sich das überlegt, ne? Ich hatte mal vorgeschlagen, aber ich glaube, das wird nicht umgesetzt werden. Sie sollen mal so einen Modus rausbringen, in dem alle Karten so sind, wie sie rausgekommen sind oder an ihrem stärksten Punkt. Das wäre crazy. Wobei das dann auch wahrscheinlich wieder balanced wäre. Weil dann ist die Frage, welche Karten würdest du spielen?
Season does not simply disappear from the meta overnight from a 1/10 of a second hit speed nerf. That small of a nerf is one of the smallest nerfs a card can get. It's usually a safe balancing option if a card is too strong and it's not certain what the best way to balance it out is, due to it rarely causing major interaction differences.
Du hättest bei diesem Spielmodus so krasse Karten. Du hättest Nachthexe, du hättest Phönix, du hättest Goblin Machine, du hättest Mönch. Du hättest dann bei Balances, hättest du den Henker, der auch mal broken war. Du hättest die Hexe. Du hättest den Royal Ghost, der zu Release broken war. Ich glaube, die Rescues waren auch broken. Rekruten waren broken. Es ist verrückt. Verrückt. Du kannst gefühlt wäre das ganze Spiel irgendwie trotzdem noch balanced, aber auf einer anderen Ebene, weißt du?
So even with this 3rd nerf,
Sepp würde Goblin Barrel one-shotten.
was doing just fine. In fact, it was still quite popular. But it was finally starting to phase out of some archetypes like Graveyard and Hog Rider Control. It was still pretty versatile, so it definitely wasn't completely gone from those, but it was now most commonly seen in Beatdown with either the Giant, Lava Hound, or Golem. After this balance change, it definitely felt much fair to go against. It still had above average rates, but I think most players were content with that at this point. And I think the higher rates can at least be partially attributed to the lack of competition like we already discussed. Minions and Mega Minion kind of remind me of the Zap and Log situation. The only 2 cards that really fit their niche and were both exceptionally popular. and nobody was crying for nerfs for either of those.
Richtig.
And they weren't even strict competitors,
einfach
since you could
Basic-Karten
find
sind.
lots of meta decks that
Es sind
included
geile
both of them.
Basic-Karten.
It's certainly not the same thing because spells are more reactive to the meta than troops are, but I think it's a pretty good analogy nonetheless. Personally, I've always had a belief that a card's versatility and lack of competition shouldn't be ignored when it comes to balancing. After all, if a card fades out of the meta because a better alternative takes over, that has been used as a premise to buff that phased card. But on the other hand, if a card isn't disrupting the meta or making it significantly less fun, then it may be best for the sake of the player base to leave that card statistically a little too good. As we go into 2019, well into 6 months after the previous Mega Minion nerf, the use rate was settling between
2019, das muss man sich mal reinziehen. 2019 ist so lange her, da habe ich begonnen, Fulltime zu streamen. 2019. Das ist 5 Jahre her.
20
Verrückt.
and 25%. It was steadily growing until around April, where it officially once again became the most used troop card in
Das ist so krank, dass Mega Minion immer noch so broken war.
competitive play at around
Aber so geil, es hat keinen gejuckt.
34% usage. And maybe I should have mentioned this earlier, but the goal for a healthy card around 2018 to 2019 was 7 to 9% usage. But at this point, I think it was pretty clear that Supercell wasn't really trying to get the Mega Minion to be around that range. In most situations, when a card has a use rate in the 30s, people would be screaming for nerfs.
Ja,
but
aber
this
der
card
konnte
didn't
nicht.
really make the game less enjoyable by being
Richtig.
in around 1/3 of decks.
So ist es.
At this rate, though, it seems like Mega Minion would inevitably get another 1/10 of a second hit speed nerf eventually. Because they were so adamant on not messing with the troops' health, there wasn't really much else to go after besides hit
Ja.
speed.
Entweder
Its next
Schaden oder
change
Leben.
wouldn't come until July
Attack
2019,
speed.
1 year since its last. This was the infamous month in Clash Royale's history where they were simplifying all
Fischer.
melee ranges. There were
Stimmt,
now
oh
3
mein Gott,
categories
damals
of
war der
range.
Pekka krank. Pekka hatte Long Range, er hat noch eine höhere Range als jetzt gehabt.
Melee short,
Das war
melee
völlig dumm.
medium, and melee long. The categories were relatively close, so most cards were able to fit into a category without any major
Also
change
ich
to their
erinnere mich, der Pekka war
range.
komplett
The
busted.
only 2 troops that were drastically affected by this were Minions
Guck mal
and
jetzt.
Mega Minion, whose range was reduced by 4/10 of a tile.
Lol,
from
okay.
2 to 1.6. It
Wusste
was
ich gar
now
nicht.
classified under the melee long category. But even this new melee long category was much shorter than what the Mega Minion had had.
Das
Just
hatte
to
ich
give
gar
some
nicht im
more
Kopf.
perspective,
Krass, das Mega Man hat damals eine deutlich längere Reichweite gehabt. Das könnte dann der Dealbreaker gewesen sein für die Karte.
4/10 of a tile is the difference between melee medium and melee long, so it was basically a full categorical downgrade
Krass.
for the minions. This was the change that really put some pressure on the card. Now it was much harder to keep it locked onto a
Stimmt, mit dem
single
Ballon, dass er
target.
hinterher
This was an
fliegt. Ja,
especially bad
aua.
environment for
Da hat er gerade wirklich den größten Painpoint des Mega Minions in einer Szene
this to
zusammengefasst.
happen in because the giant snowball was very popular, and this spell could easily knock the Mega Minion out of range
Ja,
from whatever
stimmt.
it was attacking. And since the Mega Minion moved at the same speed as a balloon, if you knocked it out of range and you didn't have anything else to stop it, then it couldn't catch up to the balloon until it made it to the tower. And perhaps the biggest interaction change this caused was now, if
Ja,
left alone,
jetzt.
the Mega Minion
Jetzt
would
seht's,
only
guckt sich
get
an.
1 hit on the tower
Das
instead
ist
of
so
2.
ein
This might
Unterschied.
not
Oh
sound
mein
like a
Gott.
lot. There was far less punishment for ignoring the 3 elixir unit and
Ja.
saving that elixir for something else. You definitely felt this if you were a Mega Minion player. Of course, its primary purpose wasn't to get chip damage. It was more of a bonus. So where it really hurt was when it was going against building targeting units, since they would now enter its range later and exit it earlier. So naturally, after the balance changes went live, the rates went down. This balance change definitely had more of an effect than a simple hit speed nerf.
Ja,
But
das
even
war ein
after a
krasser
few
Effekt.
weeks of the balance changes settling in, you still saw Mega Minion in about a quarter of Grand Challenge decks. I
Das ist halt heftig. So ein krasser Nerf und immer noch 1/4 der Grand Challenge Decks.
found it kind of interesting because in the months following July, every stat I could find had the Mega Minion's usage at exactly
Das ist heftig.
22%. So it seemed like it had settled there until we
Ja.
got to the dreaded October 2019
Egolem Heilerin.
season. I feel like in almost every video, I have to cover this season specifically because
Ja.
it was such a meta changer. Most cards this season had
Ja,
a rapid
richtig.
change in usage.
Hexe und Henker. Ich habe mit Egolem Ich habe mit Ego-Golem, ich glaube bis in der letzten Season oder vorletzten, habe ich ein besseres Finish als Zodiac gehabt, okay? Das müsst ihr euch reinziehen. Ich habe ein, ich glaube, 45er Finish mit Elixier-Golem, Doppelhexe,
For
Graveyard.
better or for worse.
Völlig
And in
bescheuert.
Mega Minion's case, it was definitely worse. The card had been holding steady at 22% usage for about 3 months by this point, but as the meta quickly changed in October 2019, the Mega Minion found itself only being played 1/3 as often as it
Guckt euch
used to
diese Hexe an, Digga, was die für einen Damage drückt.
be. Part of this can be attributed to the rise of Witch and Night Witch. As we already saw
Yeah.
in 2017, the Mega Minion had a noticeable dip in popularity when the Night Witch was all over the place.
Yeah.
And now the Night Witch was once again all over the place. And when there's Night Witch, a lot of bats are right there with it. The regular Witch was also incredibly frequent this season. Not only did it deal a hefty amount of damage, but those skeletons overwhelmed the Mega Minion more than the bats did. Mega Minion simply struggled to get value in this meta since nearly every person was using one of these two cards. Especially with the
wirklich.
slower hit speed it had since the last
Das
time Mega
waren
Witch was really
Zeiten, Chat.
prominent in the meta, it in no way could take out the swarms fast enough to be useful. But perhaps an even more prominent reason why the Mega Minion wasn't useful was due to the release of the Elixir Golem. The Elixir Golem was a new beatdown win condition released
Und da hat
this
das Mega Minion gar nichts zu tun
month.
gehabt.
And despite the Mega Minion working well with multiple other beatdown win conditions, most of the popular E-Golem decks didn't, instead favoring more expensive air support units. At first, you may assume it's simply because there was a higher demand for them due to all the bats and skeletons in the arena. And although that may be at least partially true, that can't be the only explanation. Because plenty of traditional beatdown decks were still opting to use the Mega Minion in this environment. And if we're skipping ahead a bit, there really has never been a top Elixir Golem deck that included it. This is
Ja.
because the Elixir Golem is a very
nie ein
unique
Ego-Golem
card in the
Mega
sense
Deck.
that it gives you 6 to 7 Elixir worth of stats for just 3 Elixir, giving the opponent some Elixir to compensate. So the E-Golem player saved a lot of Elixir when placing it, which allowed the luxury to play more expensive cards when supporting it. And you really had to do that if you wanted to utilize the value of Elixir Golem. October 2019 was the lowest point for the Mega Minion so far, and it still had just
Das
below
ist
average
krass.
rate.
Immer noch 7% und das war der lowste Monat bis dahin.
In the next
Heftig.
few months, as Elixir Golem, Night Witch, and Witch were toned down, you saw the Mega Minions rates rise and hold at around 11 to 16% usage, until a new air support unit was added in June, the
Skeletons.
Skeleton Dragons. This duo of dragons was taking over the game, diminishing the demand for
Die waren so broken damals, die waren so broken.
Mega Minion
Holy.
once again.
Royal
Throughout
Giant
this period,
Skelly
its
Drake
use
Hi,
rate
guys.
dropped to about 6 to 8%, not seeing another rise back up to its 11 to 16% usage range until October, where the Skeleton Dragons would finally get a proper nerf. In 2020, you mostly saw the Mega Minion appearing in Golem or Lava Hound decks, but you still sometimes saw it appeering in Giant, Royal Giant, and even the occasional Graveyard deck.
Ja, das Deck, außer warum war der Heiderin drin? Das Deck hat mich zu meinem besten Finish damals gebracht, ne? Mega Minion, Baby Dragon, Barbarenfass, Poison, Ewis, Barbarenhütte, Ritter und Graveyard. Das
It was
waren
pretty
Zeiten.
much just new variations of the same archetypes it's already been appearing in previous years.
Das war so
I
geil.
don't feel the need to go in depth going over the specifics for each one. 2021 was mostly the same. The Elite Barbarians, Mother Witch, and Bomber became meta warping come March 2021, which ultimately benefited the archetypes that
Ich habe halt wirklich mein bestes Leather-Finish im Mega Minion gemacht. Das ist crazy. Ist mir bisher gar nicht klar gewesen.
Mega Minion worked best in. In fact, in June, the Mega Minion's use rate peaked at 18% with an impressive 57% win rate. These were the highest rates it's had since 2019. I think this
18%.
was mostly thanks to the Mother Witch. She was keeping a lot of swarm
That's
decks in
crazy.
check, which gave the Mega Minion some good room to breathe. Later in the year, the rates would fall again when champions were released, likely
Digga, das ist krass, dass Mega Minion
thanks
immer
to
eine
the
Rolle spielt
overpowered
zu der
Archer
Zeit.
Queen. But as the game somewhat balanced out by the end of the year, the card's usage rate settled around 11% in challenges. The one Mega Minion deck that was consistently appearing on the leaderboards
Giant
throughout the
Double Prince
last few
Minor.
years was Giant Double Prince. Even though Mega Minion had been consistently appearing in multiple different archetypes, this exact variant of Giant Double Prince was really the one consistent deck that included the Mega Minion. It was certainly no Log Beta or Hog 2.6, but few decks lasted in the meta for as long as this one.
Ja.
So overall, throughout the entire Mega Minions history up through the end of 2021, there's never really been a period up to this point where it was considered useless.
Ja.
It's had some brief downfalls for sure,
Es war nie
but at no
nutzlos.
point would anybody seriously argue it needed a buff. It had been well over 2 years and counting since the Mega Minions last balance change by now.
Ich sage
And if
jetzt,
it
boah,
wasn't
Mega
on
Minion
anybody's
Buff.
radar for a balance change before, then it certainly wasn't now. The goal for a balanced card by now was about 6 to 8% usage with a 45 to 55% win rate. If we look at the last available stat from 2021, it did technically exceed those boundaries, but it would have been extremely nitpicky to nerf a card with those kinds of stats. Especially one the community wasn't upset
das nochmal
about.
genervt, das
But
wäre
when
dumm
even a
gewesen.
balanced card doesn't receive any sort of balance change for years on end, it's very likely that that card will eventually become too strong or slowly phase out of the meta over time. With an ever-changing environment, it's nearly impossible for any card to maintain the same rates forever. Mega Minion had generally always had a place in the game up until this point. Even though plenty of other air support units have been added since its release,
Ja,
it still had
bis
a
dahin war
place
alles
thanks
gut,
to
aber dann
being
kam
the only
Phoenix.
one that was under 4 elixir and resistant to big spells. But going into 2022, you started to see the Mega Minion phasing out of the meta. By February, its use rate fell to the 7 to 9% range, right around what a perfectly balanced card would have. And this wasn't temporary. As we go through the year, the rate stayed in that range, and even fell to as low as 5% by October.
Das ist
The
krass, ja.
2022 environment was just not as
Das
suited
Mega Minion ist seit 2022 leider nicht
for
mehr so
this type of
existent.
card. You had Skeleton King Swarm decks rising into prominence, as well as Electro Giant Cycle decks, which just weren't strategies that needed a slow-moving melee single-target troop. Classic Beatdown, Giant, Golem, and Lava Hound decks just weren't as present throughout 2022, and this took a toll on the Mega Minion. But again, I will emphasize that the card wasn't useless, it was just more niche. It still worked fine with the strategies it had been working well in. You were just starting to see different strategies arise. But virtually none of this would matter when one major event in October
Ja,
2022
genau. Und das
would
war der vorläufige
change
Tod des Mega Minions leider.
everything. We have seen new air support cards being released left and right since the Mega Minions inclusion, and although sometimes it could cause a brief fall,
Der
it would
Phoenix
always
ist einfach das Mega Minion gewesen, in 1000-mal besser und auch heute
bounce
eigentlich noch
back.
teilweise halt
And even
besser.
occasionally those
Trotz
new air
10
support
Nerfs.
cards would ultimately strengthen the Mega Minion. October 2022 would see the addition of the last air support unit the game would ever see,
Ja.
the Phoenix. The Phoenix was more similar to Mega Minion than any existing card in Clash Royale, because even though it cost 1 more elixir, it was a spell-resistant, single-target unit and didn't need to build up a charge like
Digga, ich
Inferno
weiß
Dragon.
gar nicht mehr, wie broken der war. Ich glaube, ich habe verdrängt, wie broken diese Karte war.
Phoenix was some pretty serious competition. This was certainly not a card you were ever going to see in the same deck as Mega Minion. Both
Ja,
units
Ballon,
had
Labo.
the same movement speed and range, and although the Mega Minion did slightly more damage per hit, the Phoenix still dealt enough to one-shot troops like minions.
Ja.
Moving on to the advantages the Phoenix had, it for one attacked 7/10 of a second faster,
Das ist crazy.
while having enough health to survive
Diese
a
Karte konnte alles.
lightning, had death damage, and the potential to revive itself. As you could imagine, the Phoenix was far more appealing than this old
81%.
Rust bucket, and thus the use and win rates immediately fell to being the worst they've ever
Ja,
been.
guckt euch das
having
an.
the
24% Siegesrate, ihr seht's nicht. Und 1% Use Trade ist so schlecht. Crazy.
second lowest win rate in the game, right in between its minions' brethren. Not only was the Phoenix a solid replacement to this card, it was an amazing counter. In fact, it countered all of the other flying cards
Ja.
really well. There was just no place in the game for Mega Minion anymore. The Phoenix had completely taken over the game.
Ja.
And if all that wasn't bad enough, there was an overpowered
Und
champion,
Mönch auch noch.
the Monk,
Und
released
Mönch auch noch. Und Mönch konnte mega mit der, aber Phoenix nicht. Ist
at the
crazy.
same time, which was also seen in over half of Grand Challenge decks upon launch. But wait, how would this card negatively affect the Mega Minion? It was a ground targeting troop that could
Mega Minion hat for some reason einfach ein Projektil. Ich check's bis
reflect
heute nicht.
projectiles. Well, you see, even though technically the Mega Minion is a melee troop,
Guck
it
mal, diese
attacks
schwarze
by
Kanonenkugel
throwing
da.
its spit at its
Guck mal.
opponent. And
Was ne
since
Kacke.
it's technically throwing it, that's a projectile. Thus, the Monk reflects it, meaning if a Mega Minion attacked the Monk when its ability was active, it would just end up killing itself. This was a weakness
Also das
the
Mega
Phoenix
Minion schlägt mit der Hand und spuckt währenddessen was auf den Kopf der Einheit und deswegen ist ein Projektil. Also Nee,
did not have.
das verstehe ich bis
So
heute
you
nicht.
can see why the minion cards were losing more often than every other card. It's like Supercell designed the perfect environment for them to be in the worst
Nein, es wirft ja wie auch immer trotzdem.
possible state. I mean, these rates even made the wizard look alright. I want to just take a second to question why minions were ever considered melee. They exceeded the range of every melee troop before the simplification and have all the qualifiers of a ranged card.
Ja, das
There's
stimmt.
no other melee card in Clash Royale that can have their attack reflected by a monk
Ja,
because
stimmt, ist richtig. Eigentlich ist das gar nicht Melee. Man kann es eigentlich gar nicht Nahkampf nennen.
the minions are
Stimmt
the
schon.
only melee troops with a projectile attack. Also, before the range simplification, every melee card just had melee in their stats, not
Ja.
showing the exact number, except the minions, which did show their exact
Ja,
tile
Range,
range,
das ist krass. Also eigentlich sind es Range-Units.
implying they used to be considered ranged troops. It really just makes them stand out in a weird way. The
Ja.
Phoenix obviously needed some major nerfs, and when that happened, the Mega Minions rates were sure to increase once again. But over the next few months, Supercell would give the Phoenix super light nerfs, so it would continuously box out the Mega Minion. It's actually pretty reminiscent of how Supercell treated the Mega Minion in 2016 and 2017. And now that I think about it, that's sort of
Phoenix
what happened with
einfach
the
neues Mega-Mini geworden, nur deutlich nerviger.
Skeleton Dragons too. So I guess this is just the procedure for flying support cards. Going into 2023, Phoenix was still one of the most popular cards in the game, and thus Mega Minions rates continued to be poor. But apparently,
Das ist echt schlecht. Wo stehen
Supercell
sie aber
wasn't going
jetzt?
to wait until the Phoenix was balanced out before deciding what to do with the Mega Minion. Because on March 28th, 2023, Supercell announced what would be the first buff the Mega Minion would ever receive. A hit speed decrease of not 1, not 2, but 3/10 of a second.
Das wollten sie machen. Das wollten sie machen. Das haben sie announced und dann hat irgendwer sich beschwert. Dann haben sie gesagt, nee.
That's right. They were
Machen sie
reverting it
nicht.
back to the hit speed it had when it was first released in September 2016. Now, obviously, it wouldn't have the same damage or range it did back then, but 3/10 of a second
Das hätte
was
das Mega-Mini
huge,
absolut broken gemacht und ich hätte es übel gefühlt.
especially for a card that was considered to be relatively balanced just a few months prior. It was essentially a rollback of 3 consecutive nerfs over a period of 3 years. What makes this balancing decision even stupider was that they had just buffed the Archer's hit speed, who were also underused, by 2/10 of a second in the previous set of balance changes.
Ja.
And that made them
Alter, stellt euch vor, es kommt ein Evo-Mega-Mini. Wie geil wäre das?
super broken. With this hit speed reduction, it would now be able to get 2 swings on the Princess Tower if unanswered once again. The community was freaking out at this announcement, bracing for the return of the Meta Minion.
Ja.
A few days
Und dann
later,
haben sie es einfach nicht gebracht. Das ist so bitter.
Supercell would come to their senses and realize that this was about to be one of the worst balance changes they ever implemented.
Ich sage, das wäre nicht mal das schlechteste Balance gewesen. Es wäre geil gewesen, weil da wäre endlich eine geile Karte mal wieder
So
broken
they
gewesen.
walked back part of this hit speed decrease to only 1/10 of a second.
Ja.
Part
Hätten
of
sie
me
0,2
wishes they
gemacht, wäre
just
gut
went through with the
gewesen.
original plan though, because if they did, this video would have been way more interesting. But from a game balancing point of view, this change definitely made sense. The rates were already falling throughout 2022, and the Phoenix just made it much worse. Even if the Phoenix was in a balanced state, Mega Minion still likely would have had subpar rates. But when that's the case, you don't want to give it an insane buff. After this balance change went live, the rates went back up to about what they were in October 2022 pre-Phoenix. It was a little underused, but still useful in the right deck. And that's where it hovered for a while, until around the time Evolved Bats got buffed, Evolved Archers were released, and Little Prince was released. We also saw a new tower troop, the Cannoneer, added, and
All diese Karten ballern Mega-Mini wieder. Auch der Goblin-Stein. Niemand spielt Mega-Minion. Goblin-Stein ist viel zu stark
when a
dagegen.
player was using it,
Kanoni auch.
the Mega Minion got no
Ja.
hits on the tower in a
Geil.
one-on-one interaction.
Ich hoffe, das wird wieder stärker.
After
Ich
all
hoffe, sie
these
buffen das.
developments, the Mega Minion was only seen in about 2 to 3% of Grand Challenge decks,
Ja.
which is a bit surprising considering the Mega Minion, when used correctly, is a solid counter to the popular little brat, Prince. In a surprising turn of events, though, the rates of Mega Minion at the end of March 2024 have been surprisingly alright.
Das ist jetzt 6 Monate her. Mittlerweile liegt das Mega-Mini in der GC bei 2% Nutzungsrate und 49% Siegesrate. Also leider eine absolut
And if you see him today, he
schlechte
will
Karte, liegt aber auch daran, dass 39% der Decks den Goblinstein spielen.
most certainly be paired with Golem or Lava Hound. The Mega Minion was once an incredibly versatile threat, considered to be a staple card in a variety of popular decks. But with an ever-changing environment, it has diminished to being a niche but still sometimes useful
Meiner Meinung nach eine der geilsten Karten und es wäre so geil, wenn sie die Karte buffen.
tool in modern beatdown decks.
Ich liebe diese
It's
Karte.
certainly nowhere near as popular as it was during its prime, but I don't think it needs any more changes. I feel like
Doch.
it's unlikely to get a change anyway, though. It's never gotten much attention from the developer.
Ich wünsche mir einen Buff.
And I say that because Supercell basically forgot to give it an emote. Every existing troop in the game
Ja, aber jetzt haben wir dieses Silent Emote.
got one before the Mega Minion did until 2023. And even then, they didn't
Stimmt,
bother
das haben
to
wir auch bekommen.
create one
Doch,
themselves.
das ist das, genau.
They let the community do it. One more interesting thing I wanted to mention about the Mega Minion is that even though it's a rare card, Seth, who was the community manager, stated in an interview in 2019 that he wished it was a common card.
There are definitely
Ja.
some cards that I wish we could go back and
True.
change the rarity of. Like, I wish Mega Minion could be a common. I
Oder ich
can't
glaube,
think of
Seltenheiten haben heutzutage jetzt eh nicht mehr den krassesten
a
Impact.
card that would be better suited just
Jetzt, wo Level 15 gefühlt schwerer als alles andere ist, die ganze Karte von 1 auf 14 zu bringen, sind Seltenheiten gar nicht mehr so unfassbar relevant. Außer bei Champions.
to
Gut,
be
okay.
a common.
I feel like by 2019, there were already a lot of cards that didn't quite fit into their rarity, but Mega Minion was never really one I felt was misplaced. However, given its simplicity, I wouldn't disagree with the notion that it
Ja,
should be a
ja,
common.
ja. Eine
But
einfache
card
Karte.
rarities do not change,
Super.
so no matter how much it deserves it, it will likely remain rare forever. It's
Ja.
not like a card's rarity matters that much anyway. But as always, let me know what you think about the Mega Minion and what card's history you would like to see next. Thank you all so much
Geil.
for listening.
Super Video von ihm. Wenn es euch gefallen hat, Daumen nach oben lassen. Gerne eure Meinung zu Mega Mini Kommentare schreiben. Gibt es andere Karten, die ihr sehr gesund findet? Schreibt's rein. Danke fürs Dabeisein. Cobix nicht vergessen. Hau rein. Ciao.